Let's talk about John Locke and his version of the social contract theory, um, closely connected to and very much in contrast to Hobbes, from a very similar set or very similar intellectual setup or almost like thought experiment. They draw quite different conclusions. All right. John Locke, certainly one of the most important Western philosophers, and not only in political theory, in epistemology and metaphysics and elsewise. 1632 to 1704. He's in the generation following Hobbes. I guess maybe his father was a contemporary of Hobbes, or a closer contemporary of Hobbes. And I guess Hobbes and Locke would be associated with different factions of the English Civil War of the 17th century. So if Hobbes is, using social contract theory, to some extent inventing it really in its modern forms, to argue for absolute monarchy, Locke is, whose father fought with the parliamentary forces, and who comes from a Puritan background, as opposed to a Church of England background, is on the opposite side of the forces at play in the English Civil War. And, and Locke develops, I guess, what we would think of now, anyway, as the fundamentals of democratic political theory. Or probably more accurately thought of, at least, it's not democratic in the ancient Greek sense that we saw in Plato and Aristotle. It's more like an Aristotelian polity, or a mixed form of government with different aspects of different kinds of governments, but fundamentally resting on the consent of the governed and consulting that consent, re-soliciting that consent in systematic ways. Locke was incredibly influential on the American Revolution and the founders of the American Republic, and the Declaration of Independence specifically contains a bunch of close to quotes from this document that we're reading, Locke's second treatise of government. The first treatise of government was a argument against the divine right of kings. It's not read much now because not too many people advocate the divine right of kings. That is, that God appoints our rulers. Although I guess some people still take a position somewhat like that. A biblical position on political rule. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, perhaps. All right. So Locke's social contract theory is structurally, like at the outside, considering the overall structure of the argument, identical to Hobbes's. It's got the same three-phase structure: state of nature, social contract, political state. So he tells a quite similar story, and he's directly responding to Hobbes. He's certainly got Hobbes in mind throughout the second treatise of government. He's responding to other people too. But each of the three phases is different in Locke than in Hobbes, for very important reasons, and the conclusion is entirely different. Right, absolute monarchy in the case of Hobbes, what we would call a constitutional democracy in the case of Locke. All right. One thing I think that is a little bit underestimated about Locke and the contrast with Hobbes is that I think Locke is a sincerely religious person. And I don't think Hobbes is, actually. Not to say that one of those is better than the other, but I don't think you quite get Locke's argument is rational. It's logically structured and so on. But I don't think you can actually make the whole thing without God lurking underneath it a little bit. Okay, like I think that's essential actually to Locke's positions. And when the Declaration of Independence says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that's exactly Locke's position. All right. Okay. But anyway, okay, so let's talk about this, each of these phases, I guess, and see how Locke ends up where he ends up. All right, so first of all, the state of nature. Locke also appears to hold that this is an actual historical condition that people were under, and that maybe people are under, as he writes, in the Americas, for instance. Okay, so he, like Locke, starts talking about the savages of America or Africa or tribal cultures and so on, or the kind of cultures that Europe is encountering and exploiting or destroying at this point, are in the state of nature, according to Locke as well as Hobbes. Though Locke is milder, I guess, on savages than Hobbes. But the point is, like, it is possible to live without what a 17th century European would regard as a government. And actually, I think that that's a lot of the challenge that leads to social contract theory. Like, you're encountering these societies that appear to be a lot less power stratified and a lot less resource stratified than European societies. And European societies and thinkers are regarding that as a challenge. Like, is the kind of government and the kind of hierarchy and the kind of power structures that we have here in Europe, is that defensible? Well, in a way that hardly even arises as a question unless you're seeing that it's possible to live without that. Okay, so, and what Europeans basically do with that is use it for self-congratulations. Like, those people are like animals. And we're civilized people, and civilized people need a extreme power hierarchy. But the kind of power hierarchy that can be justified on Locke's social contract theory is far milder. He's far more of an egalitarian than Hobbes, ultimately. All right. I think Locke also gives you the classical statement of classical liberalism. If you're looking for the definition of classical liberalism, and that's a word that's still thrown around a lot in political theory and stuff, or even on the op-ed page, the liberal world order and things like this, you'll hear the phrase anyway. I don't know if you'll see the reality, but you'll hear the phrase, the liberal world order that we've been living with since World War II or something like that. But those are references to classical liberalism, a philosophy resting on, first of all, universal human rights. Right? A political philosophy resting on universal human rights. It's a philosophy that's egalitarian in that sense. All people have equal rights. In Locke, that's undergirded by the fact that we're all equally created by God and infinitely precious in His sight and created in His image. Right? That's the kind of egalitarianism that Locke uses. There are other kinds of arguments for individual rights along these lines. Non-theistic arguments. For example, John Stuart Mill's utilitarian arguments for a kind of classical liberal polity. Okay, so anyway, I think the most basic features of classical liberalism as a political philosophy are individual rights, equal, individual, universal rights, and rule of law. Right? Rather than rule by arbitrary decrees of a king or a ruler. All right. And, those are fundamental ideas in Locke, and they had not been expressed, certainly with this kind of eloquence, and with this kind of philosophical sophistication and argumentative cogency before Locke wrote the Second Treatise of Government. All right, so let's look at his characterization of the state of nature. People in a pre-political condition. The state of nature, he says, this is paragraph 6 on page 366 of our textbook. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, all the servants of one sovereign Master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his and not another's pleasure. Okay, so you'll recall that in Hobbes, people in a state of nature operate by a natural law. For Hobbes, this is an animalistic law of self-preservation. Right? It's a survival instinct. Right? The only natural law is do whatever you need to do to secure yourself. Okay? There's no moral content in nature, according to Hobbes. All moral content, all moral principles, all moral effects come about due to covenant, due to agreement. They're all conventional. They're all social. For Locke, people in a state of nature are subject to morality. There's still moral laws that apply to them. It's still wrong to kill other people. It's still wrong to take other people's stuff. Okay? So injustice and justice, too, are perfectly possible in a state of nature. And human beings naturally have a God-given moral content, have a God-given moral insight. If you'll just consult your reason, you'll see it's wrong to treat people differently than you would want to be treated. I mean, essentially, the golden rule ends up being the law of nature. And the way we defend that in this case is by saying that nature is a creation of God and we are created in God's image. All right. One thing I think he's kind of implicitly asserting is that Hobbes' view is atheistic. Okay, that we're without a government, we're mere mammals, we're mere animals. Right? No, according to Locke, we're created by God, and God gives us a moral sense, a conscience, and an insight into the natural. So the basic laws of morality are natural, according to Locke, purely conventional, according to Hobbes. Right? So we can all see that in a state of nature could be a peaceable state where people see that they do have these natural obligations, these moral obligations, and abide by them fairly well. A state of nature could be a tolerable and cooperative situation, completely in contrast to Hobbes' position. But they end up kind of going in the same direction just because Locke concedes that a state of nature could degenerate into a state of war. Because people can violate the natural law and there's nothing to constrain them. So even though you could have a decent state of nature, you might not, and it might degenerate into a state of war. Locke is often thought of as a theorist of rising capitalism. And, the idea of classical liberalism, for someone like Karl Marx, is associated with capitalist ideology. The idea of individual rights, for instance, okay, being the basic political unit or reality. The idea of contract as the basis of morality and politics. That sounds pretty capitalist, right? You're doing transactions of rights and liberties when you create a social contract. Right? Locke argues, and this is one of the most famous pieces of political philosophy, and in a way it's kind of an aside. He argues that property is not created by law, okay, as many people actually do think that it is. It's a natural relation too. Property comes about, and this is the chapter 5 of the second treatise of property, famous chapter of the second, maybe the most famous piece of the second treatise, at least for economists. I have the right. I am the owner, according to Locke, in the state of nature of my own body. We have universal, equal rights. Okay? So I have a right to my own autonomy and a right to defend my own bodily integrity. I own my own body. That's the first piece of property. I am the owner of myself. Right? External property, like property in land, for instance, occurs because I mix my body with things. I mix my labor. I use my bodily labor to transform some material stuff. And if no one has a prior claim to that stuff, I then own it because I own my body and I've mixed my labor, my physical labor, with the stuff. Okay, so then it's part of my stuff. It's an interesting position, and it begins to move toward a labor theory of value. Okay, that what makes stuff have the value it does is the amount, the mixture of labor into it, and the amount of labor that's in it. So even when you get to someone like Smith, Adam Smith, or Karl Marx, they expand this into a general theory of value, that it's labor that creates value. All right. So people in a state of nature have property. Like you're trying, you've got 10-acre farm or whatever, okay? But then people can invade that. People can become desperate. People can violate the laws of nature, the moral laws of nature, and seize your property, and you've got no security for it. Ultimately, for Locke, the motivation for entering a social contract primarily is preservation of property. And that's, again, something that makes someone like Karl Marx think of Locke as a sort of capitalist ideologue. Yes and no, I guess. Of course, even if it was capitalist ideology, that wouldn't prove it was false. Right? Okay, so you might not like capitalism, and this might undergird capitalism in certain ways. It's not a screeching free market capitalism, actually. But then you need further considerations to show that the whole picture is false, right? Instead of just tacking a label on it or whatever. Again, actually, Marxists thought of both the American Revolution and the French Revolution of 1789 as bourgeois capitalist revolutions driven by people like Locke. All right. So it's true one's property is endangered in the state of nature, even under Locke's kind of benevolent picture of the state of nature. So people come together and form a contract. All right, so let's read that moment as we did with Hobbes. If I can find this here now. All right, again, very famous passage. This is chapter 8 of the second treatise, paragraph 95. Men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. Nobody can be legitimately placed under any political power except by her own consent. Hobbes agrees with that much. It's the consent of the governed, as expressed in a social contract, that on which the legitimacy of the government rests. And if it doesn't have that, it doesn't have any legitimacy at all. All right. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living, one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties, and a greater security against any that are not of it, that are not within the contract. A greater security against foreign invasion, for example. This any number of men may do, because it injures not the freedom of the rest. They are left as they were in the liberty of the state of nature. When any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated, made one body politic, wherein the majority have the right to act and conclude the rest. For when any number of men have, by the consent of every individual, made a community, they have thereby made the community one body. And this should remind you of Hobbes' Leviathan. We've made ourselves one collective agent, apparently, despite the emphasis on individual rights. We've created a collective subject in a certain way, made ourselves one body, with the power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determination of the majority. For that which acts any community, being only the consent of the individuals in it, it being necessary to that which... Okay, anyway, the majority will, since all people are equal, the majority will is the will of the body politic as a whole. This might not be the most convincing argument, but it does immediately start suggesting that voting procedures are going to be necessary to undergird the legitimacy of any form of government. All right. Now, so that's state of nature and social contract, and let's describe Locke's political state. And here I think, not to go all opinionated or something like that, but Locke has a direct argumentative advantage over Hobbes on the question of the scope of political power. All right. I mean, you'll recall that Hobbes says, anything is worthwhile to get out of the state of nature. Nothing is worse than the state of nature. And he goes really rapidly from that to an absolute sovereign, okay, whose will ought not to be ever resisted, even though you might have to resist because you're naturally trying to survive. A sovereign of unlimited power, okay. Locke argues that people who are going into a political state by writing a contract or by making a contract would never put themselves under an arbitrary total power. Okay? The reasons they're going into the contract are rational reasons. They're trying to secure their own lives and properties. They're trying to secure their own individual rights. As in Hobbes, the transaction of the contract is a transaction of rights. And specifically, you're giving up your right to punish in the political state. Like in a state of nature, if someone takes your property, you have a perfect right to punish them as hard as will deter others from doing likewise. But if everyone is punishing everybody, and taking revenge, and there's no power to constrain them, that's really when you enter a state of war, not just from the initial invasion, but also from the retribution that people try to exact, the punishment people try to inflict on one another when they feel violated. All right. So I'm giving up my individual right to punish someone who messes me up or commits a crime against me to the state in order to secure my, my basic rights, and specifically to secure my property. Right. Now, if I'm pursuing that, I would never agree to place myself under an absolute sovereignty, absolute sovereign. Why? Because that absolute sovereign could take my property tomorrow. He could order my execution tomorrow. All right. All right, I'm trying to find the relevant passage here, but okay. So this is chapter 11, paragraph 137, and it's directly arguing against Hobbes's conclusion from the social contract. Absolute arbitrary power, or governing without settled standing laws, can neither of them consist with the ends of society and government, the purposes of society and government, which men would not quit the freedom of the state of nature for, and tie themselves up under, were it not to preserve their lives, liberties, and fortunes by stated rules of right and property to secure their peace and quiet. It cannot be supposed that they should intend, had they a power to do so, to give anyone, or more, an absolute arbitrary power over their persons and estates, to put a force in the magistrate's hand, to execute his unlimited will arbitrarily upon them. This were to put themselves in a worse condition than the state of nature, where you're subject to the arbitrary will of a single person. You're very likely to be dispossessed and abused at that point. And that's the whole reason you left the state of nature and entered into a social contract, so you wouldn't be dispossessed and abused. Right? So Locke is just arguing like Hobbes's contractors, they're pictured as rational. They're making this decision because it's rational, but they're making a completely irrational decision to place themselves under the arbitrary power of a single person, or a small group of people. They would never do that if they were rational. And I think that's quite a compelling argument. Okay. Whereas supposing they had given up themselves to the absolute arbitrary power and will of a legislator, they have disarmed themselves and armed him to make a prey of them whom he pleases. And if one thing history teaches us, if there's one thing that history teaches us clearly, is that you can be as abused by your rulers as you are by one another, surely. Okay? Let's start the Holocaust, the killing fields. Right? Stuff like that, where rulers turn against their own subjects and maybe execute them en masse. Well, if you're Locke, you're a social contractor, you're trying to make sure that that can't happen, because that would violate every purpose for which you're forming the contract. All right? He says he is in a much worse condition who is exposed to the arbitrary power of one man who has the command of 100,000 than he that is exposed to the arbitrary power of 100,000 single men. Yeah, so I mean, if all of Germany is in chaos because there's no government and everyone's fighting one another in a Hobbesian way, that's pretty bad. It's much worse if the country is led by Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler has hundreds of thousands of minions at his disposal, and he's coming for you. There's no stopping him at that point. There's no defending yourself at that point. Right? So that's to be avoided at all costs, arbitrary absolute government. And like I said, I just think he's right about that, in the sense that you can't do a plausible social contract and end up with an arbitrary absolute power. So then the question for Locke, and this has been so influential, is how social contractors could form a government and limit the scope of the powers of that government. They would have to do that if they were rational, because they're going into the government to secure their lives and properties. And arbitrary power endangers that even more than a Hobbesian state of nature. It's quite true, I think. All right, so he has a series of procedures for limiting the power of the sovereign. And these have, like I say, been incredibly influential in democratic political theory. Okay, that's the whole purpose of the Second Treatise of Government as it develops, is to describe procedures for establishing a limited sovereignty, which is the only rational sovereignty that could be established by free contractors. So first of all, he says that a ruler, what we're contracting for is that a ruler won't be able to rule by arbitrary decrees. I guess I'm going to ditch the quotations, but these are close to quotations. But must rule by known and publicly promulgated universal laws that apply to everybody. All right. So the rule of law and the application of the law, even to the sovereign, we can discuss whether that's possible or not exactly. Locke does discuss this to some extent. Is a procedure for limiting sovereign power. The basic justification for rule of law is that it's a limitation on sovereign power, but it helps you live because you can predict what's going to happen. In a real rule of law society, you're not going to be suddenly arbitrarily dispossessed by the sheriff or whatever. Like, there's going to be known procedures when they come to take your stuff or whatever. Like, you have safeguards. So rational contractors would never agree to live under the arbitrary will of a sovereign, but they might well agree to live in a rule of law society in which they know what is according to law and what's against the law and what the punishments are. And there are public procedures for defending yourself, etc. All right. And public respect for a basic package of individual rights in criminal justice as in other things. And the other basic procedure that he prescribes is the division of the government into three branches. A balance of power, in short, a balance of powers. All right, incredibly influential again on the American system of government. So it's a strategy for keeping all the power from accumulating in one person's or a few people's hands. Locke regards the lawmaking power as the primary political power. That's the legislative power, the power to make law. And because law is the monarch of our society, we're under the rule of law in a Lockean contracted society. The legislative power to make law is the ultimate ruling power. Right? But he thinks that the power to execute those laws, the police power, let's say, the power to decide how, when, where to execute the laws, should be placed in different hands than the people who make them. Because then the people who make the law could abuse the law if they could also send people out to enforce it directly. So he describes the separation between the executive and the legislative functions. Now, his third branch is the federative branch, which is foreign affairs, actually, dealing with other powers. And he folds the judicial into the executive. The judicial is part of the execution of the law. So it's a somewhat different system, but it's a tripartite system, and certainly it's one of the basic models of the U.S. Constitution. I mean, Locke uses the phrase life, liberty, and property all the time. That's why one goes into the social contract, to secure life, liberty, and property. Jefferson, writing the Declaration of Independence, substituted pursuit of happiness for property, making it more general, like whatever enables you to pursue your good as a person, right? Not just property. But the formulations are very similar. And I think property probably is one of the things that Jefferson meant by the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson spent his whole life in debt, but all right. So I guess that's a real quick run through Locke's second treatise. Some of the important ideas anyway. More later. What comes next after this, I wonder? Could it be Thoreau? I don't know. All right. See you soon. Hope everyone's happy and healthy, or fairly happy and healthy.